Surrounded by enemies, he didn't move for 3 days. Not a twitch. Not a breath loud enough to hear. Just the stillness of death itself, while boots trampled past his head and voices spoke in a language that promised only torture if they discovered the truth. This is the story of a man who survived the impossible by becoming a ghost among the living, a soldier who turned absolute terror into the ultimate test of human endurance. The morning of June 6, 1944 broke over Normandy with a chaos that would reshape the world. Private Daniel Morrison of the 82nd Airborne had trained for months, jumping from planes until the fear became routine, studying maps of French hedgerows until he could navigate them in his sleep. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what was about to happen when his C-47 transport crossed into enemy airspace at 3,000 feet. The flak started before they even reached the drop zone. Morrison watched through the open door as tracers streaked up through the darkness like deadly fireworks, each one searching for the vulnerable belly of their aircraft. The men around him had stopped joking, stopped pretending they weren't terrified. They just stood there, hooked to the static line, waiting for the green light that would send them tumbling into hell itself. When it came, Morrison jumped without thinking. Training took over where courage failed. One moment he was in the vibrating cabin of the plane, surrounded by the smell of hydraulic fluid and fierce sweat, and the next he was falling through a sky lit up by explosions and gunfire. His chute opened with a jerk that nearly knocked the wind out of him, and suddenly he was floating, exposed, a perfect target silhouetted against the flames below. He could see tracers adjusting, tracking toward him. Other parachutes were collapsing as bullets tore through them, sending men plummeting to their deaths. Morrison pulled on his risers, trying to steer away from the heaviest fire, but the wind had other plans. He was drifting fast, too fast, and completely off course. Below him, he could make out the distinctive shapes of German helmets, hundreds of them, swarming through what looked like a military staging area. The landing was brutal. Morrison hit hard in the middle of a plowed field, rolling instinctively to absorb the impact. His ankle screamed in protest, and he knew immediately something was wrong. He tried to stand, but white-hot pain shot up his leg, nearly causing him to cry out. He bit down on his lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing himself to stay silent as he fumbled with his harness, trying to free himself from the parachute that was billowing in the pre-dawn breeze like a giant white flag announcing his presence. Finally free, Morrison dragged himself toward the nearest hedgerow, pulling his useless leg behind him. Every movement felt like it took an hour. Every sound seemed amplified 1,000 times. He could hear German voices now, close enough to make out individual words even though he didn't speak the language. They were searching the field, moving methodically, checking every shadow. He made it to the hedgerow just as flashlight beams began sweeping across the field. Morrison pressed himself into the base of the ancient vegetation, trying to become part of the earth itself. His hands found dirt, and he smeared it across his face, over his uniform, anything to break up his outline. The voices were getting closer. 20 yards? 10. He could hear their boots squelching in the muddy soil. A beam of light passed over him, moved away, then snapped back. Morrison's heart stopped. This was it. He was about to be captured or killed, probably both. But the light lingered only a moment before moving on. The soldier had seen something, but apparently decided it was just debris from the drop. Morrison heard him mutter something to his companion, and then they were moving away, continuing their sweep. But Morrison's relief was short-lived. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscenely beautiful given the circumstances, he realized the full horror of his situation. He wasn't on the edge of a German position. He was in the middle of it. As the light improved, he could see trucks, artillery pieces, machine gun nests, and everywhere, soldiers. Hundreds of them. They had set up what looked like a regimental headquarters in the farmyard just 50 yards from where he lay hidden. The hedgerow that concealed him was thick, but it wasn't thick enough. If he moved, if he tried to crawl away in daylight, he would be spotted immediately. But staying meant lying completely still while his bladder screamed for relief, while his injured ankle throbbed with every heartbeat, while thirst began to parch his throat. He had 1 canteen, 3 K rations, a rifle, and a combat knife. Against hundreds of enemy soldiers, these might as well have been toys. Morrison made the only decision he could. He would play dead. Not just hide, but actually become a corpse in their eyes if they discovered him. He arranged himself carefully, positioning his body in a way that looked natural for someone who had been shot while crawling. He scattered some of his gear around, making it look like he tried to reach cover before dying. Then, with a grimace, he used his knife to cut a gash in his own forearm, letting the blood soak into his uniform sleeve. The wound wasn't deep, but it was convincing. If anyone checked, they would see dried blood and assume the worst. The first test came that afternoon. Morrison had been lying motionless for nearly 10 hours, fighting cramps that threatened to make his muscles spasm, when he heard footsteps approaching. Different from before. Slower. More deliberate. Someone was walking the perimeter, and they were coming right toward his position. The boots stopped 3 feet from his head. Morrison could smell cigarette smoke, could hear the man breathing. His own heart was pounding so hard he was certain it would give him away, that the German would see his pulse jumping in his neck or notice the slight movement of his chest as he took the shallowest breaths possible. He had positioned himself face down precisely for this reason, but now he cursed the decision because he couldn't see what was happening. Something poked his leg. Once, twice. The soldier was prodding him with his boot, checking if he was alive. Morrison willed every muscle in his body to stay loose, to remain completely limp. It was harder than anything he'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at him to flinch, to protect himself, to do something. He did nothing. More conversation in German. Another soldier had joined the first. They were discussing him, he realized. Probably debating whether to search his body or just leave him. Morrison felt hands on him then, rolling him partially onto his side. He let his head loll naturally, kept his eyes closed but not squeezed shut, kept his jaw slack. One of them was going through his pockets. He felt them take his cigarettes, his lighter, the photograph of his girl back home that he kept in his breast pocket. Then one of them noticed his wound. More excited conversation. They thought he'd been shot, that he'd died trying to reach cover. One of them said something that might have been a prayer or a curse, and then they were walking away, leaving him there as just another casualty of war, not worth the effort of burial. Morrison didn't move for another 2 hours. Even then, it was only to shift slightly, impossibly slowly, to relieve the agonizing pressure in his bladder. That night, under cover of darkness and the noise of German vehicles moving in and out of the farmyard, he finally allowed himself to urinate where he lay, hating the indignity of it but knowing he had no choice. He used the same darkness to eat one of his K rations, taking tiny bites and chewing as slowly as possible to avoid any sound. Day 2 was worse. The sun beat down mercilessly on his exposed position, and Morrison realized he was in serious danger of heat exhaustion or dehydration. His canteen was already half empty, and he knew he couldn't risk drinking too much. He had no idea how long he would have to maintain this position. For all he knew, this German unit might be here for weeks. The pain in his ankle had evolved from sharp to a deep, throbbing ache that suggested serious damage. Probably broken. Definitely unusable. Even if he could somehow escape, he wouldn't be walking out. He would have to crawl, and crawling through enemy-occupied territory with a broken ankle seemed like a special kind of impossible. But what choice did he have? Surrender meant a POW camp at best, execution at worst. The Germans were known for their hospitality toward paratroopers, whom they considered elite troops and treated accordingly. Morrison had heard the stories. He would rather die in this hedgerow than give them the satisfaction. So he stayed still, all through that second day, as German soldiers walked past him dozens of times, as vehicles rumbled by close enough that he could feel their vibrations through the ground, as the sun cooked him and his own stench rose around him. Morrison remained motionless. He began to hallucinate from the dehydration and stress. He saw his mother standing in the field, calling to him. He saw his drill sergeant from basic training, screaming at him to get up and move. He saw the girl from the photograph they'd taken, the one he'd been planning to propose to when he got back, and she was crying. He forced himself back to reality by focusing on small details. Counting blades of grass. Watching ants march across his hand without moving to brush them away. Listening to the conversations around him and trying to pick out individual words. Anything to keep his mind occupied, to prevent it from sliding into the kind of panic that would make him move, make him reveal himself. On the afternoon of the second day, something changed. The activity in the farmyard intensified dramatically. Officers were shouting orders, men were running to positions, vehicles were being started and moved. Morrison had been around enough pre-combat preparations to recognize what he was seeing. The Germans were getting ready for something big, probably a counterattack against the Allied advance. This was both good news and terrible news. Good because if they moved out, he might finally be able to escape. Terrible because they might be moving out in response to an Allied advance, which meant Morrison could end up caught between two armies in active combat. He'd survived this long by playing dead. He might actually become dead if he stayed put. As evening approached on that second day, most of the German forces did indeed pull out. Morrison watched through slitted eyes as trucks and half-tracks rolled away, heading east. But his heart sank when he realized they hadn't all left. A small contingent remained behind, maybe 20 or 30 men, enough to hold the position and guard the supplies that had been left stacked in the farmyard. And they had set up their defensive positions in a semicircle that put Morrison directly in their line of sight if he tried to move. That night was the worst yet. Thunderstorms rolled in, soaking Morrison to the skin and turning his hiding spot into a muddy hollow. The rain was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him water, which he caught in his mouth and cupped hands when the lightning flashes weren't too frequent, but it also made him miserably cold and increased the risk of hypothermia. His teeth wanted to chatter. His body wanted to shiver. He couldn't allow either. He could hear the German soldiers taking shelter, complaining about the weather, probably wishing they were anywhere but there. Morrison knew exactly how they felt. At one point, he was certain he was going to die right there in that hedgerow, that they would find his actual corpse in the morning and never know he'd been alive the whole time. The irony of that thought almost made him laugh, and he had to fight down what he recognized as hysteria. Day 3 dawned clear and cold. Morrison was weak now, genuinely weak, not just pretending. He'd eaten only 1 ration in 3 days, had drunk perhaps a pint of water total, and hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. His ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, and he was pretty sure he was running a fever from infection. The cut he made on his arm had been necessary for his disguise, but it was angry and red now, another problem he couldn't address. But on day 3, everything changed. Morrison heard it first, a sound he'd been praying for since he'd landed in that field. Artillery. American artillery, and it was getting closer. The distinctive boom of American 105mm howitzers was unmistakable, and they were walking their fire toward the German position. The remaining German soldiers were scrambling now, preparing to either fight or flee. Morrison made a decision. If the Americans were coming, he needed to signal them somehow without getting himself killed by friendly fire. But he also couldn't reveal himself to the Germans who were still dug in around him. He would have to wait for exactly the right moment, that brief window when the Germans would be too distracted to notice him, and the Americans would be close enough to see his signal. The shelling intensified. Morrison could feel each impact through the ground, could hear the Germans shouting to each other, could smell the cordite drifting across the field. Then he heard something even better. American voices, calling out challenges and responses, the sound of infantry advancing under fire. The Germans began to retreat, pulling back through the farmyard. This was his chance. Morrison waited until most of them had passed his position, until the last few were focused on the advancing Americans. Then, summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he rolled onto his back, pulled out the orange recognition panel from his gear, and waved it above his head. A bullet cracked past his head, fired by a retreating German who'd spotted the movement. Morrison flattened himself again, still waving the panel. He started yelling, screaming at the top of his lungs. "American! American! Don't shoot! 82nd Airborne!" More bullets. But these were flying both directions now. The Germans were caught between Morrison's position and the advancing American infantry, and they were focused on the bigger threat. Morrison kept yelling, kept waving his panel, and suddenly there were American soldiers around him, providing covering fire, pulling him back toward their lines. "Jesus Christ, how long have you been there?" one of them shouted as they dragged him to safety. 3 days, Morrison croaked through cracked lips. "Playing dead for 3 goddamn days." The soldier looked at him like he'd grown a second head. 3 days? In that hedgerow? With Krauts all around you? Morrison nodded weakly. Seemed like the thing to do at the time. They got him to an aid station, where a medic confirmed that his ankle was indeed broken, that he was severely dehydrated, that he had the beginning of an infection, and that he was probably the luckiest son of a bitch in France. Morrison didn't feel lucky. He felt like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. But he was alive, And after what he'd been through, that seemed like victory enough. Word of his ordeal spread through the division. Other soldiers would come by to see the man who'd played dead for 3 days, who'd laid motionless while enemies walked over him, who'd maintained such perfect discipline that trained German soldiers had checked his body and left him for dead. Some of them treated him like a hero. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. Morrison never felt like either. He'd done what he had to do to survive, nothing more and nothing less. The real heroes, he thought, were the men who jumped into the fire with him, who'd fought and died to secure the beachhead, while he was lying in a hedgerow trying not to breathe too loudly. He'd just been lucky, and stubborn, and too scared to do anything but lie perfectly still. But there was one moment, weeks later, when he was recovering in an English hospital, that made him think differently about it all. A young lieutenant came to interview him for an after-action report, trying to understand what had happened in those confused first hours of the invasion. When Morrison finished his story, the lieutenant just sat there for a moment, processing it all. "Do you know what you did, Private?" the lieutenant finally said. "Do you understand what kind of mental toughness that took? 3 days without significant movement, in pain, dehydrated, surrounded by enemies, never knowing if the next second would be your last? That's not just survival. That's something else entirely." Morrison thought about it. Maybe the lieutenant was right. Maybe there was something in those 3 days that went beyond just luck. He'd discovered something about himself in that hedgerow, something he hadn't known was there. The ability to endure absolutely anything if the alternative was unacceptable. The capacity to turn terror into absolute stillness, to become something other than human for just long enough to stay alive. He never talked much about those 3 days after that. When people asked, he'd give them the basics and change the subject. Because how do you explain what it's like to lie in your own filth, listening to men speak a foreign language while they debate whether you're really dead or just playing possum? How do you describe the feeling of a boot prodding your leg while you force yourself to stay limp, knowing that one twitch, one wrong breath, means capture or death? How do you put into words the way time stretches and contracts when you're measuring your life in heartbeats, each one potentially the last one you can afford? You don't. You just survive it, and then you live with it, and you hope that you never have to test yourself like that again. Private Daniel Morrison survived the war. He went home, married that girl from the photograph, had 3 kids and a long career as a high school history teacher. He lived to be 87 years old. And for all those years, whenever he felt like giving up on something, whenever life got hard or painful or impossible, he would remember those 3 days in a French hedgerow. If he could endure that, he figured, he could endure anything. His students never knew. His kids barely knew. But inside, Morrison knew. He'd played dead for 3 days and lived to tell about it. That was enough.